Hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Victoria Whitford used to be a far-stream diplomat in the Foreign Office. She served in Kosovo, Iraq and the British Embassy in Washington, as well as India. In 2015, she switched careers, and with a science degree from Oxford already in the bag, she rapidly qualified as a doctor. As the pandemic hit its peak in the UK, she was working on a COVID ward in East London. More recently, she's been contributing to research on how best to detect COVID in patients. Victoria, welcome to Insight.
Thanks, Nick. It's good to see you.
Before we begin speaking about the pandemic, I'm going to ask you straight off, why did you quit a stellar career in the Foreign Office to become a doctor? Victoria.
Well, it's a long story, but I'll give you the brief version. I had served in lots of interesting and fascinating and difficult places around the world. I'd worked in Kosovo, Iraq for over a year, briefly in Afghanistan, and I'd come face to face with people in all sorts of situations of distress. I felt that foreign policy wasn't necessarily really helping them, and I wanted to be more involved in their lives. So through a long period of transition of thinking about what could I do that would use my science background and as well as the skills I'd learned as a diplomat, I arrived at medicine and then spent 4 tough years training and qualifying as a doctor, and I'll be training for probably at least the next 10 years. And you know, the great thing about medicine is you learn throughout the whole career.
Fantastic. Can I be really intrusive? What age did you change careers? How old were you when you sort of left the Foreign Office?
So I was 39.
Right. Okay. Some people would say that's still very, very young.
Yes, well, I hope so. I mean, I have to say, I am surrounded by people who I'm actually old enough for some of them to be their mother, but it's a great job, and I'm glad I've done it, and I know there's plenty of life left in me yet,
right,
and a long career ahead, I hope.
Absolutely. Well, I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation. I think not just because of your recent experience, but also because you've been working in government for some time and you know about the difficulties of making policy and implementing policy. So I think this gives you quite a unique perspective. Just to start with, can we go back to the beginning of the pandemic when we knew that the virus was coming our way? It was already in Italy, and it looked very, very bad. And there was a lot of criticism of what was going on in Italy. What preparations were being made here? What were you aware of? What was going on in the region you were working in?
Well, I think, unfortunately, at the beginning, not a lot of preparations were being made. Back in February, I remember going to work and we were all talking about coronavirus, but we didn't really have patients starting to arrive, and I think nobody was very prepared. It was not until the middle of March, I think, that we really got ourselves into gear, and of course by that point things in Italy were really, really bad. And I remember at work we had a lot of crisis meetings, so junior doctors and consultants sitting together in the lecture theatre at our hospital, discussing how we were going to organise things and what we were going to do. So I think it was, I'm afraid, quite last minute. At that point, some various decisions were made, such as we wouldn't rotate out of our existing jobs, we wouldn't move into a new training position, but we would stay where we were, and then some people were surged into jobs in medicine, but there was a great deal of difficulty, really. Nobody really knew how to do that, and one of the things I did fairly early on was work with the medical director at my hospital in order to come up with a staffing plan, because I mean, basic things were not known, such as we didn't know how many doctors we had or where they all were. That information was not easily accessible. It was stuck in outdated HR systems that people couldn't really access. So I worked with colleagues to put together a staffing plan, which became the basis of the sort of surge crisis plan for the hospital. I mean, obviously I didn't do all of that myself, but I worked on it. And then by really sort of the middle to end of March, we were in full swing, where the hospital was rapidly filling up with coronavirus patients, and our normal sort of hospital work had stopped. We had ended all of our surgery, so there was no elective surgery going on. We were still doing very limited amounts of emergency surgery, but even that was questionable because we didn't really know how to do surgery on patients with coronavirus. People who would normally come to our accident and emergency department stopped coming, and we had a huge wave of patients with coronavirus. Some of them who needed just to be in for a few days, or they would come in sometimes because they were worried. And those we could turn around quite quickly. But the vast majority of patients who came to hospital were very sick and needed treatment for days to weeks.
How did you all cope? I mean, this is quite a direct question, but personally, how did your teams cope together? And then also professionally, in terms of the procedures that you had to respond to? Because at that stage, it was still very unknown what kind of thing you were dealing with.
Well, it was very difficult. I think firstly, it was, I think everybody experienced a wave of kind of adrenaline and fear because we didn't know what we were dealing with. Of course, we're doctors, and the whole point of being a doctor is you have to be prepared to put yourself on that front line in order to work with patients and to save lives. And if that means putting your own life at risk, then so be it. And in some senses, I felt I had some experience of that from working in Iraq and Afghanistan. And for me, it was very interesting because I felt as if this experience of working with coronavirus was actually quite similar to the things I had done before. I knew how to work in a crisis. I knew how to manage a crisis plan, how to write a communications plan, which I did for the hospital. I felt reasonably comfortable, but I think we were all afraid because very quickly we ourselves started becoming sick. So in about the middle of March, our very wonderful infectious diseases consultant, who is a young man, stood in front of our lecture theatre and showed us the first chest x-rays of people with coronavirus and talked us through the management plans for people with coronavirus. And those chest x-rays were horrifying. They didn't look like normal pneumonia. In normal pneumonia, you'll see a chest x-ray with what looks like a sort of a white patch in one area of the lung. And you know that that is the area that the pneumonia lurks in. You treat that. Normally, if it's a bacterial pneumonia with antibiotics, if it's viral, you may give other drugs and you will give oxygen. But the chest x-rays for people with coronavirus looked completely different. There were foggy patches throughout the lungs. I mean, they looked like they were alien images. We'd never seen anything like this. And that was very frightening. And this lovely infectious diseases consultant, after about 3 weeks of standing up in front of all of the junior doctors working in medicine at our hospital and talking with us about how to put on personal protective equipment, how to treat these patients, what to do, he himself became sick. And this then started a wave, really, of all of the people who were working on those front lines. Most doctors at our hospital became sick at one stage or another. I was very fortunate because I didn't become unwell. I'm not quite still sure why that was, because I was up close and personal with coronavirus patients for the best part of 2 to 3 months. But I didn't become unwell, but a lot of my colleagues did. So in terms of how we coped, I think, we experienced fear. Some people became unwell. But we also just got on and did the job that we trained to do.
You've spoken a bit when I spoke to you recently about just the difficulty of working with PPE and the layers, just the practical side of it and how uncomfortable that was for weeks.
Yeah, so at the beginning, I think we were sadly rather woefully unprotected. So the advice that we were given at the beginning was that all we needed was a plastic apron, and these things are thin. I mean, they look like they look like a bin liner. They're very thin plastic. So a plastic apron, a simple surgical face mask, and a pair of gloves. And we quickly realised that that was not going to cut it. That's not the World Health Organization advice. And in our hospital, because we had large numbers of patients who were using oxygen in a way that sprays lots of droplets, we started using a more enhanced kind of PPE, which is the sort of thing you will have seen on the television in Italy and also in the US. I mean, everywhere really. So this involves, first of all, you wear scrubs, so you don't have to wear your own clothes, because of course the clothes you wear become infected. So they have to be specially laundered and treated in a certain way. So you start off with a set of scrubs, and then on the top of that, we would wear a long-sleeved, fluid-repellent surgical gown, so the kind of gown we would wear when we're scrubbed in to do surgery. Then over that, a pair of either sort of blue gloves underneath, so plain kind of plastic gloves, then sterile surgical gloves over the top of those, mostly because they have long sleeves, so you can get a tight seal with the gown. Then on top of that, we would wear a respirator mask that covers the nose and the mouth and has a very tight fit. So when you breathe through this thing, it has a filter in it, so it's got enough protection to filter out some virus particles, one would hope. Then normally a hood or a head covering of some description, and then on top of that, a plastic apron and shoe covers. So this stuff is hot and sweaty. We were having a heat wave throughout the end of March and April, and we would spend many, many hours in this kit. The sort of procedure was, in order to go onto the ward, because you have to get gowned up in all of this garb, it takes a while, but also at the end of it, you don't want to just throw this stuff away. You don't want to have to put it on and take it off and throw it away because there was a shortage of equipment. So once you're on that ward, the idea was that you would stay on it, and normally we would try and do everything in one go. So we would stay on the ward for about 4 hours at a stretch. And that means you don't drink any water, obviously you can't go to the loo, and you're there with patients who are very, very ill, themselves very distressed, frightened, needing oxygen, they have masks on, it's very hard to communicate because you can't really hear each other. It is a very difficult and stressful environment, and I think, and it was hard for doctors, but I think it's obviously much, much harder for patients, because all of this feels to them, I think, terrifying. When you go onto that ward wearing this stuff, you look like that you sort of, you look like you're in a laboratory, not in a hospital.
People at the time when the lockdown was first introduced, people I think who were sort of frustrated by the impact this was having on the economy and also quite skeptical about the government's advice, was saying, look, we should let the virus rip. It's only going to affect the elderly and more vulnerable people in society, and if they've got to go, they've got to go. We need to keep society together. We need to keep the economy together. I think there's less of that said now as time goes on. But when you heard that, or if you still hear it, what's your reaction?
So, I mean, this is interesting because my reaction has changed, actually. I think at the beginning, I wondered myself whether the economic measures we were taking in lockdown were the right ones. I think after having seen a coronavirus in action on hospital wards for 2 months, I am sure that they are the right ones, and I think we probably should have taken them earlier. I mean, obviously I can't use names, or I have to be careful about patient confidentiality for obvious reasons, but I think it's helpful just to give you a sort of an idea of what our patients were like. I treated one young man. He was young, he was black, he was in his 40s, he looked like a basketball player. He was tall, fit, very fit, he had a good job, he was married, he had children, He was in his early 40s, and the only thing that was wrong with him was that he had high blood pressure. Now, high blood pressure is very common in this day and age. If you come from a Black ethnic background, you are more likely to suffer from hypertension just because of your ethnicity and your genetics. It's got nothing to do with, you know, sort of how you behave. You are just more genetically prone to it. And this young man came onto our ward and started off with oxygen through a face mask, which was very common. So most people, they'll come on, they don't have an oxygen requirement, or it will be a very small oxygen requirement. So they'll be receiving oxygen through what are called nasal cannulae, which are two little prongs that go up the nose. And then the pneumonia develops, so their need for oxygen goes up. So then we move them on to what's called a non-rebreathe mask, which is, it's not a tight-fitting mask, it's a loose-fitting mask that delivers up to 15 litres of oxygen. And then the pneumonia develops, as it did in this man, and we moved him on to something called CPAP, which stands for Continuous Positive Airways Pressure, which is a very tight-fitting mask that goes over the nose and mouth, and then it attaches to a machine that pushes oxygen in under pressure. I've never actually put it on myself, but I've had a mask near my face, and the sensation's a bit like having your head out of a car window, except you've got this on 24/7. You can't take it off, because the minute you take it off, you desaturate and your oxygen levels drop and you go blue and you start struggling. So this poor young man struggled on with this mask for about a week. And then, as many of our patients did, he became tired, because it's very tiring trying to breathe in that way when you have acute respiratory distress syndrome and you're very unwell with this pneumonia. So eventually we took a decision, which we discussed with him in the middle of the night, to intubate and ventilate him. He did not want to be intubated and ventilated. Very few of our patients did, actually. Most of them were frightened, and understandably so, because, you know, this is not a pleasant experience. A team of people came from ITU in the middle of the night. I was with that team. I helped the team. We bring with us lots of equipment, so a portable ventilator, drugs that we need for intubation and ventilation, and we comfort the patient, and then we put them to sleep and put a tube down their throat, which is attached to a machine. And this man went to ITU, and I looked after him in ITU over several weekends for about a month. And then when I moved back from ITU onto the respiratory wards, he was still there. And eventually he was transferred with many of our patients to another hospital. I mean, the good news is that he survived. I had lots of conversations with his wife. Of course, one can't have visitors during the middle of this pandemic. We weren't able to have visitors because coronavirus is highly infectious and we didn't want to increase the spread. So I spoke with this man's wife on the days that I was working on ITU, and she was amazing. I mean, it's a very, very difficult situation to be in when you can't see your loved one and you know that they are on a ventilator in ITU. And this woman was really incredible. Every day I spoke to her, she was generous, kind, hopeful, trusting, knowing that we were doing the best for him. And of course she was anxious, but she had faith that he would come through it. And he was very lucky because he did. But, you know, the reality of ventilation as a treatment for coronavirus is it's a supportive treatment. It doesn't, you know, in some ways it doesn't really necessarily change an outcome. I think a lot of that in some ways depends on the patient themselves and how healthy they were before they came into hospital, and whether their body is capable of taking this treatment, because it's a very, very, it's a very punishing way, really, of looking after somebody. It's very, very hard on the body. So that's one story. He was a young man and he had high blood pressure, and he was lucky because he survived. I saw lots of other patients who did not survive. We had a very lovely young woman, again, she was in her 40s, who came to ITU. She was very overweight. She was Romanian. She lived in a shared house with 12 other adults and 6 children. So she did not come from a socioeconomic background in which sort of the chips were on her side, if you like. She spent 7 weeks in ITU, and amazingly, we managed to step her down from ITU with a tracheostomy, which is a common way if someone's been on oxygen for a long time. When you take away the intubation tube, they don't do so well. So you can put a tube in the front of the trachea that helps them to breathe. And this lady she stepped down to the respiratory ward, and then in the middle of the night, her tracheostomy blocked off, it started to bleed. The nurses tried to suction her. One of my colleagues came and worked with her. I arrived on the ward early in the morning, and she then had a cardiac arrest, followed by another cardiac arrest. We got her to ITU, and then the decision was made to withdraw the life support, and she died. And this again was a woman in her 40s who didn't really have a particularly awful medical history. She was overweight, and she had type 2 diabetes. And those things are risk factors for not doing very well in coronavirus. But I think the picture of it's just old people is definitely not the case. We did see large numbers of elderly people coming in, and very sadly, a lot of them did not survive.
Yeah, I think it's important I want to remind everyone, I didn't say this at the beginning actually, and I should have done that. This is on Chatham House rules, so everything we're discussing here is non-attributable, and we just have to sort of keep it within insight, as it were. I want to talk a bit more about policy, and you're deeply affected by this, and anything the government does or we do affects you sort of directly, and also know that you're not afraid of speaking your mind. What mistakes do you think were made at the outset, early in March, as the virus hit, or as the virus became we were more aware of it, and certainly it had hit Italy by then? What mistakes do you think were made at that point?
So I think the first mistake that we made was giving up on a strategy of containment. And I know that we moved back to a strategy of containment, but at the end of February and in early March, one of the things we did was stopping community testing. Now, up until that point, over the school half term, children and their families have been told, if you've been away over half term to a country which has large numbers of coronavirus cases, you must self-isolate. You can't come back to school, you can't go to work. And we had mobile community testing, so vans coming around with people wearing hazmat suits, and giving people nasopharyngeal swabs. Now, the swabs themselves are another issue, because the test itself is not a very good test, and we can talk about that a bit if you like. But essentially, we gave up on all of that and said, no, we're not going to test anyone in the community anymore. We're only going to test people in hospital. Now, I understand some of the reasoning behind this, which was that the testing capacity was limited. But the decision, I think, at that point should have been, instead of Public Health England taking over testing and saying, okay, we're going to do it, it's only going to be in a limited number of sites, and we will control this and ramp up with our own Public Health England testing sites, i.e. governmental sites, rather than saying, okay, we don't have the capacity for this. We need to continue testing in the community, because you can only have a strategy of test, track, and isolate, i.e. a containment strategy, if you have very widespread testing. So for me, that was the first mistake, was saying, we're not going to test in the community, we're not going to ramp up through the private sector. And what we saw then is a kind of, what for me I felt was a bizarre sort of yo-yoing really, where the doors were then thrown open and the response was, okay, we will let coronavirus run riot through our country and we will deal with it by intubating and ventilating everyone in hospital. Now, clearly at this point, doctors had not been consulted, because if you ask a doctor whether they would rather have a strategy of containment with test, track and isolate, or a strategy of what the UK did, which was let's have a ventilator challenge and we'll try and make 12,000 ventilators, a doctor would never come up with that strategy, because how are you going to staff 12,000 ventilators? You know, what do you think is the outcome of putting 12,000 people on ventilators when we know from the recovery trial led by Oxford University that the death rate, the mortality rate of ventilator patients is about 40%. Where were we going to find, amongst the roughly 55,000 doctors in the UK, enough doctors to staff 12,000 ventilators 24/7? I mean, it's just not going to happen. It was, for me, madness really, to see ventilation as the solution to the coronavirus challenge. You know, I think the thing is that within the UK, we actually have a very good, tried and tested public health system. We know how to deal with notifiable diseases. So, for example, if you look at meningitis or tuberculosis, two very unpleasant, highly infectious diseases, we have a tried and tested system for dealing with those. And what we do is, once we test the patient, we isolate them while we're testing them, and then if they test positive, we use contact tracing to contact everyone that has been in contact with them in the weeks or months running up to them developing this illness, and then we isolate those people. And even if you decide, or even if that strategy, given the large numbers of people contracting coronavirus, fails, my view is you have to try it. And this is why the World Health Organization was saying test, 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 trace and isolate, because we know that that is the strategy that works with outbreaks. You know, in infectious disease medicine, it's very clear that that is the strategy that works. So, I think the idea of going for herd immunity was not a wise idea, and I think for me that's out of the bag.
To be fair, they say the government claims, or 10 Downing Street spokesman claim that they never actually made that statement, although there were advisors suggesting it. I don't think it was actually a public claim that they were going to go for herd immunity.
No, I mean, I think that's true. No one ever came out and said we're going to have herd immunity. But if you listened to the press conferences given by Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the impression that was given was that at this point we cannot contain the virus, and if we cannot contain the virus, the next best option is to for everyone to catch it. And
essentially saying by failing to test and trace, they basically abandoned the idea of literally tracking where the virus was going to go, and that was they just gave up on it.
Yeah, and then they came back to it. So for me, the issue is about changes of policy. It's about not having a coherent strategy. So the strategy at the end of February, which was mobile testing, tracing and isolating, was a coherent strategy. And then I think there was a sort of wave of fear or panic where policymakers felt, no, this is not containable. It's going too fast. It's out of control. And if it's out of control, what do we do? At that point, I feel the strategy should have been, let's just hold our course. Whereas instead it was, okay, the cat's out the bag now, let's launch a ventilator challenge, which looks like, I mean, it's a good PR strategy for the public, I think, to say, we're going to solve this through ventilation. But in reality, for me, that does not that's not going to solve the problem. And I think now what we've come back to is something that is much more coherent, which is a test, track and isolate strategy. And I feel that if lockdown in the UK had happened earlier, then maybe our death rate would not have been so high, and perhaps our recovery would have been quicker.
Yeah, no, the death rate is staggeringly high. I'm going to ask everyone to put their questions in now. So please start writing them in the Q&A box below me here. And I'm going to get Karen, who most of you know, who's a medical doctor as well, who works, we both run the company together, to join me as well. So please do start chipping your questions, in there.
Hi, Victoria.
Hello, Karen.
Nice to see
Good to see you.
So I'll come back to the policy issues, and I've got questions about the government being guided by science, which I know you've got some views on. But just to step back a bit, to go back to the actual disease itself, what are you working on now, and are you prepared for the next wave? What's being done, and do you think you're ready for it?
So, do you mean in terms of research or practical preparation?
Let's cover both. So I know you've done you and your colleagues have been doing some research, which is interesting, but then also talk about the practical measures. So 2 questions then.
Okay, so I'll talk about the research first. So in our spare, in inverted commas, time, one of the things we did was look at the data for all of the patients who came through Whitford Hospital where I work, in 2 weeks, at the end of March and the first week of April of this year. So we looked at all of the patients who had been tested for coronavirus, which was about 1,000 patients. And we went through those and found those who either had a positive test or patients who had a clinical diagnosis, because often patients will test negative for coronavirus, but they still have coronavirus. And one of the problems with the test for coronavirus is it's only about 70% sensitive, which means if you have coronavirus, there are 100 people with coronavirus, the test that we use will only pick those people up about 70% of the time. So it will say that 70 people have a positive test and 30 of them don't, even though they actually have coronavirus, which is a pretty worrying statistic, really, if you think about testing in and of itself. But anyhow, we took all of those people who had a positive test or a clinical diagnosis, which over those 2 weeks was about 450 patients. And we, mostly very late at night, went through their records to establish how fast their heart was going, what levels of oxygen they needed, what treatment they had had, what their blood test results were. And we all of the parameters that are measured in hospital we looked at, and we've done various things with that. We've looked at how ventilation is, whether or not ventilation is an effective strategy. And what we have found actually is that putting people on high flow oxygen, so either high flow oxygen that goes up the nose, or with this very tight fitting face mask that feels if you've got your head out of the car window, that can be as good a strategy as ventilation. So we've been looking at that. We have looked at risk scoring. So we think we can establish from people's blood results and vital signs when they come in, we can tell fairly well what their risk is of needing ITU care. So people who are at high risk of mortality or severe complications from coronavirus, we think using this data, we can judge from fairly simple parameters. And the thing that I'm also personally doing is looking at pulmonary embolism. So we know that people with coronavirus have sticky blood. We don't really know why that is, but we know they have sticky blood and that they get clots in their blood, which can travel into their lungs and make them very sick. And this seems to be a complication of coronavirus. So I'm looking at our diagnostic strategy for that and seeing whether it's the right one. So that's the research bit of it. And in terms of the practical preparations, I mean, I don't feel very confident about this. I have to say, I wish I did, but I don't. I feel that a lot of the lessons that we should have learned over the last few months, we have not learned. I think we have learned the lesson about personal protective equipment in that our hospital now has stockpiles of it and assured supplies. But there are simple things. So, for example, the wearing of scrubs for me is essential because one of the risks with coronavirus is that you will take this disease home on your clothes, hangs around on clothes for several days, and that you will spread it to other people through your clothing. And nosocomial spread, so spread within hospitals, is also a huge risk. And yet, we're already getting the message within our hospital that wearing scrubs is expensive, it costs a lot, and therefore scrubs are now only being supplied for areas of the hospital which use what are called aerosol generating procedures, so high flow oxygen, ventilation, ITU type procedures, which for me, I think that's short-sighted. I think we have learned some really valuable lessons about how to support doctors and about the numbers of people that you need to look after patients in stressful environments. And very unfortunately, I think what will happen in August, when we go back to our normal routines and the training jobs open up again, is that we will behave just as we did before. So very stretched rotas, not enough doctors to cope with the situation should the virus return. And I think I'm worried about that. On the positive side, I think we've learned a lot about treatment. Some of the results that have come out from recent studies have been really helpful. But at a governmental level, I don't think we've learned the most important lesson, which is about investing in a health service. You know, the NHS is chronically underfunded, and I think that we just haven't learnt the lesson about how to support it. Nick, I'm worried that I've lost you because your video has frozen.
Yes, I think he has frozen, Victoria. In the meantime, Marty, who's just joined the panel, she does have a question. Should we go to Marty's question until Nicholas joins us back?
Sure.
Again?
Hello, Marty.
Good morning. Well, it's morning in the United States. Good morning, Victoria.
Good morning.
Just before I logged on to this session, I saw a news report from Australia that scientists, you mentioned sticky blood, that scientists there have developed a blood test, and they mention in it sticky coagulating blood that will test for both current coronavirus and if the person has had it in the past, and the results would be available in 20 minutes. Is that anything you've heard about yet?
So there are certainly antibody tests out there. And I mean, antibody tests do use they work using a type of stickiness. It's not the type of stickiness I was talking about, but they do work in the way of getting bits of the blood to stick to a panel that then works with a reagent to tell you whether or not you have antibodies in the blood. And there are antibody tests which have recently come out, and they will tell you whether or not you have circulating in the blood antibodies which show current infection or past infection. Now, I've had an antibody test. It was a blood test. Unfortunately, it didn't take 20 minutes. I got the result in 3 days, which obviously I would like to be quicker. But I think the issue with antibody tests is in some ways they're not really a game changer. I think they're useful in that they help to back up evidence from things like nasopharyngeal swabs, so the test that I was telling you about where you put a little cotton bud up the back of the throat and into the nose and says, do you have active virus particles? So the antibody tests don't tell you that, but they tell you, are you developing an immune response, or have you had coronavirus in the past? Unfortunately, they tend to work best. They have very high levels of accuracy when they're taken either when you have symptoms or up to about 2 to 3 weeks after symptoms have resolved. The current state of play is that we think that antibodies to coronavirus decline very quickly. So you can test negative with an antibody test, even though you have had the virus. So I think people like them because they offer what feels like certainty, but what they don't do is they don't change the game in that they don't tell you that you're now immune. They don't tell you that you no longer need to wear protective equipment. They don't tell you that you won't get coronavirus again. But they do tell you if you've had it in the recent past, whether or not you've had it. And people like that.
Thank you.
We're back. We seem to be plagued by a temperamental Zoom connection. Please do, come on you lot, you've got to ask more questions here. I know you've got tons of questions. You're being unusually timid this time.
You can ask me anything. I might not be able to answer, but I'll try. And I'm happy to take questions about what I did before as well as what I do now.
We in the UK are getting back into, things are opening up. Wales too. Are you happy about the way that's being conducted? I mean, I can't. It's very difficult to ask you to look, assess all of the government's measures across the economy. That's a bit unfair. But I mean, I'm just from a personal perspective, the economy's got. We've all got to get back to work somehow. We've got to learn to live with it. What are your feelings?
I think this is interesting because obviously when lockdown happened, not very many people wanted it, and yet we all had to live with it. And during lockdown, some people I think enjoyed the opportunity to step back from normal life and live in a slightly different way. For a lot of people it was very, very difficult. I think what has happened during this pandemic is there has been a great deal of both justifiable and understandable fear. And now our Prime Minister has said it's time to go back to work. Unfortunately, the public don't really agree. And when you look out there, what you will see is empty tube trains, streets with very few people in them, and parents who are afraid to send their children back to school. Now, the issue of children is an interesting one because if you look at deaths in the UK from coronavirus amongst under 18s, the numbers are very, very low. We have had 3 deaths in the UK of children under the age of 18. Even those children who have developed the Kawasaki-style inflammatory syndrome have recovered. If you look at the numbers, it's actually more dangerous to go to school and face the risk of a road traffic accident than it is to go to school and run the risk of coronavirus. But public perceptions are very different. So I think one of the things if I was Boris Johnson, I'd be looking at this and thinking, well, I told everybody to lock down and they did. And well, mostly they did, and not everybody obeyed me. And now I'm telling them to go back to work and they're not listening. And it's very difficult to control the actions of 65 million people.
Yeah, I was fascinated by a graph that was tweeted by an epidemiologist looking at the cases in Florida. And the graph highlighted sort of hotspots, and the brightest spots is where the infection had taken off again after the was it the May week? I can't remember. It was a particular US holiday, and the cohort between 20 and 24 was where it started. Then the infection spread into the high age groups. But the interesting thing also was it spread into the younger age groups as well. Not as aggressively, but it nevertheless went into that 15 to 20 cohort, and then below that as well. And the question there is, if you're young, you might not die from it. You might be perfectly fine, but certainly you might be able to give it to somebody else as well.
I think that's exactly right. That is exactly the issue. There is no evidence that transmission rates are different between different age groups. They look fairly uniform. However, obviously when you're young, your chances of recovering are much better.
Right. Okay, let's bring in some more questions. We've got
We've got lots of questions on the screen.
Yeah.
I can see Richard there.
Yeah, so let's bring up Richard Murphy and Diane Cook, which both of you have got some slightly similar questions. Let's have them one after the other. So Richard Murphy first. Richard Murphy first, please, and then Diane.
Okay, hi. Really, my question is back to that March decision. I'm wondering, were the wrong experts in the room advising them? Because just to give my background, I'm an actuary. So I was following the numbers, and my wife was in intensive care at the start of March with something unrelated to COVID. So I had a lot of time. And as soon as they went public on it, I immediately, as an armchair observer, knew that it was a disastrous strategy. You're saying you knew immediately, not following the WHO formula for dealing with infection was a disaster. How can that happen in a room, I suppose, of advisors to the Prime Minister?
Let's follow that up with Diane as well. Similar question, not quite the same. Go on, Diane.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
My question, Victoria, is around the communication strategy, because I felt from the beginning that nobody was talking to me. I had these very boring background and these three men usually droning on about things. And that, I guess, ties in with what you were saying, that now that apparently things are better, people aren't accepting that. So I just wonder what you think about the communication strategy and whether it could be improved.
So those two things are related to each other. Victoria.
So I think, right. Well, I think sort of two issues. I think the one thing I want to say is about how governments use advice. So, you know, as a policymaker, as a politician, you have advice that's given from various quarters. There'll be scientific advice, there'll be political advice. There's lots of different advice. And as a politician, you have to make a decision. And unfortunately, your decision is often going to be based on not what is necessarily the right thing to do, but based on what the public reaction is going to be. And I think in the early part of March, I don't know for sure, but I suspect that the Prime Minister was thinking, if we lock down, what will be the results of this? People will be horrified by it, people will be upset by it, people will lose their jobs, and therefore I'm not going to do it. And by the end of March, I think the decision about lockdown had become more acceptable. I think by that point, people were asking for it. People were already at that stage not going to work. They were in many ways ahead of the Prime Minister in terms of their decision making. So unfortunately, I think political decision making is driven by, does one think that the voter will vote for this? What is the public reaction going to be? On the communication strategy, for me, the key issue there is about trust. And unfortunately, I feel that this government, and I don't want to sort of put myself as a Labour supporter or a Conservative supporter. I try and kind of be fairly apolitical about these things. But I think the way decisions have been made has involved a lack of transparency, and the government has not been open with us about the sorts of issues that have fed into their decision making. And as a result of that, public trust is undermined. So now people are not going back to work because they don't trust the advice that it's safe to go back to work. And I don't really blame them, because if you are out there and you have seen a policy which has gone in one direction and then another direction and then another direction, it has been justified all the way along, and no one has ever said, actually, we made a mistake. You know, we did not do this as well as we could. We made a mistake. Now, okay, I accept that governments never say that they make mistakes, but I think in this setting, in order for there to be trust, decisions have to be made in a way that's more transparent. And just saying, you know, all of this nonsense about we're relying on the science just does not cut it for me. I mean, science is not about delivering truth. Science is about a process of discussion and debate and challenge and mostly uncertainty. It's about uncertainty, and it's about tolerating uncertainty and knowing that you don't know the answers. And I think the honest thing to do would have been to say, these are the sorts of scientific issues that have fed into our decision making. But at the end of the day, we're leaders and politicians, and we have to make decisions based on what we think is in the best interests of the British public, bearing in mind that there are economic effects and scientific effects and effects on people's health, and we have to think long term and all those sorts of things. And then this is the decision we've made. But that is not how governments operate. You know, governments operate on the cycle of the next election, unfortunately.
You would have thought that with a majority of 80, they would be more comfortable with the possibility of making mistakes and saying we got this wrong because you've got such a large buffer there in Parliament. But it seems that 80 majority is not as strong as we might think.
Well, yeah, I don't think it's, you see, I don't think it's about the majority. I think it's about the personalities of the people involved. And, you know, in order to say that you made a mistake, you need an ability to reflect. And I don't think we are working, unfortunately, with a particularly reflective government.
Yeah. Okay, Philip Godfrey. Philip, go ahead.
Can you hear me, Nicholas?
Yeah.
I want to be a bit mundane, I guess, in addressing this rather important topic by actually just talking about the operational aspects to the whole pandemic. A lot of people, you know, you meet in you know, down the pub or whatever, saying this is all chaos, it's chaos, nobody knows what they're doing, the government's making up the policy from one day to the next. And I wonder whether a lot of this is being driven by some of the operational limitations in terms of how to deal with it. I'll give you some examples that, and I'd be interested, Victoria, in your view on this. If you take the face protection as an example, in the latter part of March, early April, there was a lot of statements being made to the effect, wearing masks is not necessarily the answer, it probably isn't going to work. And I listened to that and I thought, well, there are no masks. So if you make it mandatory that everybody has to wear masks, and there aren't any masks because the supply was restrained, you have an immediate political problem. When I listened to the track and trace conversation and the possibility of an app, I immediately felt Iowa caucuses, for those of you who are with us. This will probably not work. You've got to have good testing capability. You've got to have it distributed locally, and we don't have the infrastructure. And then you've got to turn around the tests quickly, otherwise there's no point doing it at all. And I have worked quite extensively in laboratory testing in the NHS, and you know, my thought was this is probably not going to work from an operational point of view. But it's just interesting the way that the policy has ebbed and flowed, and we think it's about the science and about strategy, but I think a lot of it might be underpinned by the capability or lack of capability from an operational point of view. So how do you track all these people, you know, from a logistical point of view? How do you do it? Where do you get the masks from when your strategic supply chain is based in France and Macron goes, you can't have the masks? So my question to you, Victoria, as you're at the front line, is my narrative, does it hold any water, or would you push back on me? Or what's your view on that?
I think you're probably right, actually. I don't have very much to argue with there. I do think the policy has been dictated by the exigencies of what's possible. Yeah. You know, it's taken us until June to have a policy of wearing masks because we didn't have any masks. Yeah. I think that you've hit the nail on the head actually there. So I'm not going to push back against it at all.
Right, Andy Mendes and then Simon Jackson. So Andy Mendes. Andy. Go on, Andy.
Yeah, I'm here. You caught me unawares. I was thinking about masks, and I'm not speaking with one. Although mine's a completely tangential question, a different question, taking you back to your previous lives, Victoria. we've heard, particularly from the glorious leader of the states, who I will not name, that the WHO is doing a terrible job and is all to do with China. I've not heard much at all from the UK government about this, but with your experience of working in the various sort of outposts, and now with your experience in the medical world, do you have a view about the WHO's efficacy, balance and usefulness?
I'm just going to interject here again. Just remember, this is all on Chatham House rules, and anything we say here is non-attributable. Okay.
And say hello to Huawei while we're at it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And with that caveat in mind, Victoria, and you don't have to offer an opinion on this at all if you don't want to. It's up to you.
No, that's fine. I mean, I actually think that the World Health Organization is a very useful organization. I have never worked personally with the WHO, but I have been to Geneva and worked with international organisations in Geneva, so I have a bit of an idea of what the scene is like. I mean, you know, all of these organisations are large, bureaucratic, and hard to navigate your way around. Nonetheless, I think that WHO does fantastic work. It is very heavy on experts. It is expert-led. I don't think it is a particularly political or politicised organisation. I think the same problems that plague all UN agencies plague the WHO, and that it's large and it takes time to make decisions. You know, I think it does a really good job. I mean, I agree that I think some of the things that Tedros said in relation to China were probably not as careful as they could have been. But you know, the information that they put out, the strategy that they put out, the work that they do is, in my view, excellent.
Okay, Simon Jackson.
Just have a quick follow-up on that.
Sorry, yeah, go on, Andy. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sure.
So the other question, sort of the follow-on question, I suppose, is, are they in a position to actually influence the way that the various governments in the world behave, or are they shouting in the darkness?
Well, they have a significant impact when it comes to vaccinations. They define policy on it, don't they, Victoria?
Yes, they do, although again, vaccinations, I mean, a lot of these issues are about public trust and confidence. I mean, a lot of health in general is about how you persuade people to behave. So you can have a policy in vaccinations, but you can't force a mum to drag her baby to the doctor and stick a needle in its arm. So, you know, a lot of the work that the WHO does is around communication and capacity building. I do think that they have the ability to influence governments, but in order to do that, the governments have to want to listen. And, you know, there's a whole debate that rages around international organisations and are they greater than the sum of their parts? And at the end of the day, international organisations are made up of states who cooperate together in order to do some work. So the WHO can have influence if the governments that it's talking to want to listen to it.
Simon Jackson.
I think my question's been answered, but Annie's got a slightly better one.
Annie,
you have made some fascinating points from a perspective I haven't heard yet. So I want to ask you about your view on whether sufficient thought and planning for the required resources has been given to the question of the long-term therapeutic needs of the people who don't recover, you know, within a matter of weeks, but those who are still suffering going on now for months. And I'm thinking in terms of, you know, it does appear that there are going to be people who will struggle to get back to work, you know, in any time soon after they've had a severe case of the disease.
I've been reading lots of different stories. Obviously, one issue is about breathing and just not being able to get the oxygen capacity back. And then there's an issue of depression, and some research suggesting that the virus gets into all your organs, you know, including the brain. And there's anyway, you some of this may be poppycock, as they say, but go ahead.
Well, I don't think it is poppycock. I mean, coronavirus is interesting for lots of reasons. So I don't know how much you know about this or how much you want to know, but the coronavirus spike protein attaches to receptors that we have in our body that link to angiotensin. So angiotensin 2 is a very, very potent vasoconstrictor. So it's a hormone that makes your blood vessels constrict. And that's really useful because it helps to keep your blood pressure up. Now, we have ACE receptors all over our body. We have them in our lungs. We have them in our kidneys. We have them in our blood vessels. We have few of them in our brains, but the evidence is that coronavirus is a multi-system disease. It's not just a respiratory disease. So if you have coronavirus, you can get it all over the place. And we see people with inflammation in their heart. We see people with neurological disorders. We see people with kidney failure as a result of coronavirus. It is a multi-system disease. And in terms of recovery, there are certainly people who will take a long time to recover. And I think there is now thought going into how to cater for the long-term rehabilitation needs of people who are struggling. Have I still got everybody? Because I think I've lost Nick again. Oh no, he's back.
We're back.
Sorry, chaps.
Right. So shall I keep going on this one?
Yeah,
I think we're lucky in the UK in that we actually have very good rehab facilities. So we, again, all of these sorts of institutions and facilities have struggle from lack of funding, and the funding has gone down as time has gone by. But we do have rehab facilities for people. Then they're not specifically for people with coronavirus, but we have rehab facilities that cater for people with ongoing physiotherapy needs, with neurological needs, and we have the amazing Putney Neuro Rehab Hospital in the south of London. We're lucky in the UK in that we have very good social care. So people will get that support, but it's always under threat.
I've lost the question, so I'm just going to go to the
It was about long-term rehab.
Yeah, but next person up, who I think I think it's possibly Fran Hoffman.
Well, thank you. Actually, I have two questions, one of which you touched on earlier, and that's the question in the US, we're in a big debate about reopening schools. So if UK physicians were advising us, what would you advise? But unrelated to that question is an issue you raised about antibodies, and you mentioned that antibodies for coronavirus seem to drop off relatively rapidly. And I wanted to know what the relationship between that fact and the efforts to develop a vaccine might be.
So that's a very good question, Fran. I think, so there are lots of different vaccine efforts going on out there at the moment. The ones I know a little about are the Oxford vaccine trial. So they are using an adenovirus from a primate and then using that to get the body so they put the spike protein into the adenovirus, and then the adenovirus goes into the body as part of the vaccine. And then the idea is that the immune system will recognize the spike protein from coronavirus and develop an immune response. Now, fortunately, there are lots of aspects to an immune response that don't just involve antibodies. Antibodies are a very important part of the immune response, but there's more to it than that. And the other side of it is the T-cell response. So I'm waiting to hear the results from the Oxford trial. They're going to publish some of their early results on Monday in the Lancet. So it'll be interesting to hear what they say. But the sort of the leaks that we're hearing are that although the antibody response is not fantastic, the T cell response is good. And as a result of that, people who have the vaccine and are exposed then to large amounts of coronavirus, what we're learning from the animal studies that the Oxford group have done are that so they've exposed primates, and what they think happens is that the primates, they still develop coronavirus, but they don't become unwell from it. So some of that has to be from a T helper cell and T cell response. So antibodies are a big part of an immune response, but they're not the only part of it.
Right, so I think we've got Louise Tarrant next. Louise?
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks for the work that you're doing. So a lot of the public communications, particularly from government and the health leadership, is really quantitative in nature. So it's graphs and statistics, it's death rates, it's infection rates, testing rates. And what I found really compelling about the story you told tonight, which was very personalised and not sanitised, was about sort of just the brutality, if you like, of the treatment and what people go through. And so I'm a bit surprised, particularly as different countries struggle at different times in this sort of long pandemic, when people are sort of a bit restless about lockdowns, etc., that there's no visual presentation of the impacts in a health sense and a personal sense. And I wonder, is that because they don't, there's a notion of not scaring the public, or is it just people don't think about that? It's just that, the way you talked tonight just gave a picture that said, hey, I don't want to be in hospital. I don't want to have this thing.
Well, I agree with that. I think that we do rely on numbers and statistics. It's interesting though, because obviously everybody these days gets a lot of their news from social media, and the sorts of things that are being shared on social media, I think, are more personal stories, which have, I'm afraid, a fear factor with them. The sort of issue for me around that is, again, it comes back to trust. The nice thing about numbers, I mean, people talk about lies, damned lies and statistics, but one hopes that with numbers you can kind of trace them back to a source and assess whether or not they are reliable. And it's harder to do, I think, with personal stories, because they tell you a part of the picture. So what I'm sharing with you, I guess, is my experience. I mean, I do think that the treatments that we have for coronavirus in terms of ventilation and oxygen are brutal. They really are. And I remember driving into work one morning when I wasn't able to use the tube, and hearing a woman on the radio talking about how she was terrified that if she got coronavirus because she had a disability, that she would be refused treatment on a ventilator. And I was thinking to myself, well, if you knew what this treatment was like, then you might refuse it yourself. So I do think there is value to personal stories. I think they're important. However, I think they need to be put in context, and this is why numbers are useful. So my, I think, personal impression of having worked with ventilated patients was that the death rate was very high. But yet we know from the recovery trial that the death rate of ventilated patients is about 40%, which still feels to me to be pretty high. But that's different from the impression I have from my own experience in a hospital. So I guess what I'm saying is I think you need both.
But Victoria, that's also, not everyone manages to come off a ventilator in other circumstances.
So that is also, you're absolutely right.
You know, people don't realize that it's not a wonder cure. It's
No.
a last resort and can sometimes be successful and sometimes not.
Exactly, and there are long-term sequelae for people who have been on ventilators. You know, whether or not they had coronavirus, being in ITU is a traumatic experience. And there is a well-known sort of syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder that goes with being in an ICU. So for me, the strategy is, it was always about prevention is better than cure. You know, you don't want to go there unless you have to.
Yeah.
Chrissy Fegans, we had half a question from you online. I'm hoping you've got a full one now. Chrissy. It'll take you a time to get your microphone unplugged as well. Chrissy, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Go ahead, go on.
Well, I'm just so overwhelmed by Dr. Victoria's wonderful comments. We're in Melbourne and going through a surge currently, which we thought we'd got over coronavirus. We were all a bit happy with ourselves. And guess what? We are not over it, and we now have a surge. So there are, in our state, there are 438 people with that have just been picked up with the virus recently. There are about 2,000 overall. I know they're small numbers in comparison to other countries, but for us, that's significant because we thought we were sort of out of the woods on this. It's fascinating to listen to what you have to say because you're at the coalface, as it were, and talking in a way that we don't hear politicians or other people expressing what's going on. And so that's, you know, I'm very grateful to hear that. When we in Melbourne see what's going on in the UK and Europe and America, we're feeling a bit sort of smart ass, really, because we haven't been affected in the most significant way. And I wonder how much leadership plays in an outcome of something like this.
Oh, I think it makes a huge difference. I think leadership plays a part. I think culture plays a part. So there are some interesting experiences from places like Taiwan, Mongolia, where you wouldn't expect, Vietnam as well, where you wouldn't necessarily expect to look at those countries as kind of health leaders, but in terms of coronavirus, they have had very good results, and they have had good results because they have been decisive. They have had a culture which allows a command and control style approach to government. So if the government says something, people are used to doing it. Which, you know, is not always the case in democracies, but has advantages in situations like this. But I think, you know, New Zealand is also a really good example of very, very decisive leadership. Now, of course, these are countries with lower populations. They have had fewer people coming in and out, but they've taken very decisive action, and that, for me, is what makes the difference. I think leadership is key, and leadership has to be at every level. It's not just at the top of government. It has to be within hospitals. It has to be within public health systems. You need leaders. I mean, one of the things that I've found disappointing about the NHS is generally a lack of leadership. I don't think doctors in the NHS, although there are some many excellent professionals, you know, there are some absolutely wonderful doctors out there, but I would not say that there is a culture of leadership, of learning to lead within the NHS. And I think that's a shame, because in order to solve any public health emergency, you know, any political crisis, you need leadership. It makes a huge difference.
Yeah. it's fascinating, just picking up on what Chrissy was saying about how different countries have been affected by the virus and how they responded to it. And I think the levels of the virus in our society are much higher than they are in the area around Melbourne, yet we're going back to work, we're thinking about opening up our schools. So in a way, I think we're saying that we're going to have to live with this virus and live with it for some time, and that we here in the UK have to get used to having, certainly we'll clamp down when it pops up here, pops up there, but we have to get on with our lives, and there is going to be some degree of mortality that goes with that. How long do you think we're going to be living with this for?
Ooh. Forever?
Forever?
Forever. I mean, I think, this coronavirus is here to stay. There are lots of coronaviruses already out there. We have them in the common cold. I think we will develop a vaccine. I think it will be probably like the influenza vaccine, in that it will have to change, and we will have to have it every year. I think it will confer reasonably good immunity, but I think coronavirus is here to stay. And I think our societies will adapt as a result.
Well, that's possibly a very bleak but fascinating point to end on there. Unless anybody else has got any more questions there, I think we can wrap it up. What we do generally here, Victoria, is have a discussion among ourselves, and we just get everyone to give their thoughts. If you want to stay on the line and chip in, I'd love you to do that. If you've got another sort of 10 or 15 minutes or so, that's fantastic. Our next talk is next Thursday, and it is next Thursday, isn't it? Next Tuesday. Oh, I missed one out. So it is next Tuesday with Timothy Caldas. Again, that's a Chatham House rules briefing, so very much sort of off the record, and that's really on what's been going on with in Egypt, and President Sisi, who's leading a very, very tough line there at the moment. So that's next Tuesday at 4 p.m. BST. Do join us for that. Please do stay on the line, everybody else.
I'm going to listen. I think I'm really interested to hear what people have to say, and just like to say
okay, brilliant.
For your insightful questions and for taking the time to listen to me. I've really enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed being part of this conversation.
Well, I think, Victoria, I think there are some leaders in the NHS, and you might be one of them.
I always jokingly say to Victoria, I'm really looking forward to reading your obituary, because I know it's going to be fascinating. It's going to be one of those obituaries you read, my God, how did she manage to do all of this? So I've always...
This is an example of British humour. Not for everyone.
I shall get you to write it for me, Nick.
Oh yeah. I need the money somehow or other. Anyway, let's just get anyone. You can put your hand up, or I'll just pick on you. Those are the people who've been asking questions already. Richard, as somebody who studies death and the statistics related to it, I'm going to pick on you to start with. Richard Murphy, are you there?
Yeah, just on the. It's all fascinating, but what about the impact on non-COVID treatments? And I'm just thinking here, an old friend of mine has degenerating eye symptoms. I don't know the exact details, but he's borderline suicidal now, knowing that he may go blind for lack of treatment as his appointment dates push further and further out. And it feels like there's a real huge backup of non-COVID treatments. What's going to happen over the next year or two?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah.
Go on.
So, I mean, I think this is a huge problem, and it's been a problem right since the middle of March, when we stopped elective surgery and normal kind of appointments, normal ways of doing things. If you look at excess deaths, the excess deaths in the first week of April were about, I think it was 6,000 more than normal. And those deaths were not all attributable to coronavirus. About 2,000 of them from March were attributable to coronavirus, but the vast majority were not. And I think we will see a huge amount of excess mortality and morbidity. So people becoming unwell because they haven't had access to healthcare. I think it's a massive problem. And unfortunately, I think the whole sense of just shutting everything down in terms of hospitals, it just makes life really difficult. I'm sorry, my husband is he's wandering around in the background. So if you hear noises, that's because he's making himself a peanut butter sandwich.
I'm a bit peckish too. Richard, does that come? Do you want to come back to that?
Well, I think it's trying to understand. I mean, again, the personalised stories. My wife's been having treatment for cancer. Unfortunately, it looks like she's not needing any treatment over the next 9 months. But it is a terrifying thought that if pre-COVID, people are worrying about a second wave. Doctors can only do so much at one time, and in an already stressed NHS, I mean. It's almost the impossible question I think I'm putting to you is how do we get through the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, you see, I think that some of the decisions and choices that were made within the health service were not necessarily the right ones. I don't think we had to stop doing everything. I think we just had to do it differently. I don't think we should have stopped doing cancer surgery. I don't think it was necessary. I think what we could have done and should have done and are now doing is we've essentially taken over Britain's private hospitals. So elective surgery for cancer is now happening in private hospitals because they don't have nosocomial spread of coronavirus, and everyone that goes in has to isolate for 2 weeks before their surgery and then they're treated. We could have done that back in March. I think, sorry, Karen.
That's happening in South Africa. Certain hospitals are COVID and others aren't. And the doctors aren't allowed to move between them. The medical staff isn't. And some doctors do work in more than one hospital. It's all stopped. And non-coronavirus patients still have their surgery. They have to have a COVID test 24 hours before, 48 hours before they let in. And they have to have been isolating for 2 weeks.
We also haven't spoken about care homes and how the failure to isolate them and also staff and how that could have been dealt with in a better way.
Yeah, I mean, again, with community testing, if you hadn't shut down community testing, then I don't think we would be in this situation. I mean, again, just some of these decisions were strange, So, for example, once the cat was out of the bag and we thought that coronavirus was going to take over the country and we needed 12,000 ventilators, the decision was to take everyone off elective surgery, partly because of the risks of spread in hospital, but also because, all of these surgeons were being trained to become ITU doctors. Now, I think that's a bit mad. I really do. If you're a surgeon, okay, you're going to have skills that are useful to work in ITU, but you're not going to be an intensivist. You're a surgeon, and we still need surgeons. There are positives around some of this. So if you look at issues like telemedicine, so doctors generally don't like telemedicine. They don't like doing stuff through Zoom or phone calls or anything like that, for very good reason, and it's much better to see the patient in person. But the point is, it is possible. These things are all possible.
We can see a lot of panic taking place at a sort of political level, which is understandable. And I think all of us put in a similar situation would have been panicking too. If you were the Minister for Health or Secretary of State for Health, would you have reacted any differently? Do you think you'd have had the sense to be able to stand back and make an assessment? And you have to have a deep knowledge of how the NHS works as well.
You do. There's a good argument, I think, then for having a Minister of Secretary of State for Health who was a doctor, or at least worked in the medical profession, or at least, or had been a nurse or understood the nuts and bolts of this. You can't make policy on the fly for things like this. And I would have liked there to have been in place a pandemic plan. It's not, you know, it's not rocket science to figure out that there will be an outbreak of something at some point. We've been talking about this for 15 or 20 years now, and yet when it arrived, we were not ready.
Yeah, just to, I've got a very useful message from Isabel here that the Parliament's Committee on Science and Technology is meeting at 3 p.m. And there'll be Sir Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty being interviewed by MPs, plus various other experts from Public Health England and also the NHS. So that if you want an afternoon of COVID and to continue viewing, you just tune in 30 minutes time. Let's get a few more comments here. Sarah Biffin, who's my mother, and then we'll follow with Caroline Sumnall. Sarah, you need to double check on your microphone. I think you might not be able to do it. Let's take Caroline. Oh, yeah, you're there. Go on, mother.
Mine is probably out of date. I wanted just to say that my annual eye appointment at the Western Eye Hospital at the beginning of May was changed to October and has now been put to the end of November, and maybe it'll go to January in the end, and that's an annual one for glaucoma. Or do I mean the other thing, Karen? Whatever it is.
No, that's right.
Okay.
I mean, I just think that's a terrible shame, isn't it? I just think it's a tragedy, actually, that this pandemic has derailed healthcare.
Yeah. Caroline, get a comment from you, and then we've got Louise Tarrant. Louise, it looks very dark in your study there.
Is it in the middle of the night?
It
maybe,
is.
in Australia?
It is not in the middle of the night. It looks very dark indeed. But Caroline first, and then Louise in the dark.
So just firstly, a book recommendation for everyone. If you haven't read it, Spillover is worth reading. And it's basically written before the pandemic, but about lots of different, but it's not a heavy book. It's sort of like almost like a novel about pandemics. It's really, but true. And secondly, I just wanted to ask if there's a good source that you've come across for the kind of latest information. So I'm on there's 8 of us running the COVID response for a 1,000-person business, and just every kind of little detail, like do we turn the aircon on when people go back to work, or do we put hand sanitizer out? How do we let people use the loos? Like all of those things, and we're taking decisions by looking things up ourselves. And there must be some sort of brilliant source of kind of here's the new latest information, surely.
It's terrible, isn't it, Victoria? It is terrible. It just seems, it does seem to be the blind leading the blind. Yet we have a country with a very advanced, technology and health sector, and we seem to be clueless.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say on this, actually, in terms of risk assessments for businesses and for schools, although it pains me to say it, the .gov.uk website is actually quite good. It's decently laid out, it's relatively simple, things are reasonably easy to find. So there's some quite good advice in there about what to do. However, it is advice, and it leaves you to make all of the decisions yourselves, which I think for a lot of people is really daunting. I mean, none of us are public health experts.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Go on, Caroline.
It's probably also worth noting, so I live in the middle of Shoreditch, and I was shocked to go out the other night and the pubs were all full. I mean, social distance full, so not rammed, but you couldn't have more people sitting in there. And again, people not wearing face masks. We've seen what's happened in the States. It's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, Victoria, do you think we're going to see an uptick again in August, September?
I think we will. I don't think it will be as bad as it was in March and April, but I think it's hard to predict. And as people start going out again, I think it's inevitable. I mean, what I find astonishing about this is, I'm traveling on the train and I see an awful lot of young people who don't wear masks. And there seems to be the feeling that if you're young, you're immune from this. Or that you don't need to take the responsibility to protect others. And for me, this is very societal. I mean, you know, we've got a big drinking culture in the UK. I think we've got a big cultural problem generally about health and about looking after each other. And some of the stuff that happened during coronavirus was really positive because one got the sense that people were generally caring a bit more about each other. But I wonder how long that will last.
Yeah. That's a really good question here from Diane Cook, which I'm going to ask. She says, which part did ideology play in the UK government's actions? And she says she was on the edge of the ventilator debacle. Interestingly, we've got a talk coming up in August that'll deal with this, specifically looking at how the government handled it. And that's with Stephen Castle from the New York Times. And we've got an op-ed writer also from the Evening Standard. Two very, very good speakers coming up in August who have had access to the lobby previously and then know how it operates. So that should be fascinating. So a question there on ideology from Diane Cook. But let's also get a comment from Louise. I think, Louise, you were going to say something. Louise Tarrant.
Sorry, it's Yuri, her partner.
Yuri, Yuri.
Sorry, there's something I don't quite understand, and that's the interface between the most senior public policy health advisors and the government. So in the context of Australia, we're a federation, each government, federal and state, has its own chief medical officer. And the two things that the government decided in Australia was that they would form a national cabinet, so the premiers of each state and the Australian government head formed a national cabinet, notwithstanding political differences and all the rest, and they formed a committee of all the chief medical officers as the source of advice to this national cabinet. So there was a single voice going into the cabinet and a single decision making that went back to the community and the rules established. Now, the states were able to vary them according to their own specific circumstances. Now, England, well, not UK, has, you know, where is that the interface between that public service medical advice and the government, and, you know, the degree to which it was not heeded or not listened to or whatever. I mean, the decision was made that the advice from that group of chief medical officers will be primary in the initial stages.
We're having a discussion on next Thursday with two people that really addresses part of that, which looks at how the 4 different nations within the UK have responded. And part of that is a constitutional question, which is you've got the home nations asserting more power, and there's more friction with England issuing directives from the chief medical officer, which are only advisory in Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland, and they are asserting their own powers increasingly. Victoria, do you want to pick up on what you were saying there?
Well, I was going to mention some of that. I mean, I think that we have such difficulties in our relationship, in the relationship between Westminster and Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, that this is really tricky because we don't sit down as 4 devolved nations and have these conversations because it's politically far too difficult to do it. I think, you know, there is SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies, and they were giving advice. I feel a bit sorry for Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance because they've sort of been paraded as these figureheads, as if they were the people that were making all the decisions, when I don't think they were really. I think that their job is to give advice and that they gave the best advice that they could. And they're not politicians, and it's not really their job to go out there and front a press conference every day. But that's really what they were being asked to do. I don't know what part ideology played in that. I am sort of more in cock-up rather than conspiracy theory territory here, and that I think decisions were driven by political expediency and need rather than coming from any particular ideological position.
Nevertheless, there is this tension within the Conservative Party, particularly on the backbenchers, who probably are more libertarian and want the economy to open up. And also, I think certainly some reticence at the beginning. And Boris Johnson's quite libertarian as well. The reticence there, I think, on his part to clamp down in the economy, not fully cognizant of what impact it was going to happen until later on in March. My view.
I'm sure he wouldn't be able to cope without his morning run. And this is Britain. People need to take their dogs for a walk.
With that, I think we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, we have to take Bertie for a walk.
Yeah, our dog's waiting in the kitchen, scraping at the door.
And I have to pick up my children from school.
Right. Victoria, thank you so much. It's been a really, really interesting discussion, and you've answered, you've been open to all questions, and thank you very, very much indeed. I can't wait for your obituary to develop.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed talking to everybody. You've been a fantastic group of people to talk with, so thanks for all those great questions. I really enjoyed it. It's nice
meeting you. Best of luck, and I hope your family stay safe, and we really, really do admire what you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I hope everybody manages to get to their appointments at some point very soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks,
Victoria. Thank you.
Bye, Victoria. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. Do join us on Tuesday. That's Egypt's Clampdown. Talk to you all then. Bye for now.
Bye.